Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. I'm Joe Gary, and I am delighted to welcome you to Broadway Buzz. Beautiful, a spectacular musical. There are no apologies for this musical. The music is delightful, the staging is spectacular, the cast is extraordinary. If you get the impression I really like the show, you're right. It's an amazing work. And of course, it is a tribute to the brilliance of Carole King. Of course, her music would literally define an age. She started, just let me give you this as a background. Keep in mind, she was 4 years old and learned to play the piano. She could read music and also invent her own music at 4. By 15, she conducted an orchestra, and by 17, she had written her first hit song. Do you feel like you're not a major achiever? I mean, God, it's a spectacular career. And she would go on, keep in mind, going into her 6th decade for really still being one of pop music's most beloved singer-songwriters. She's an extraordinary artist. Her music has literally permeated the world. It's part of our memory and tradition. Keep in mind, she wrote 400 songs. 1,000 of them were recorded by major artists, including Celine Dion, Barbra Streisand, I mean, the Beatles, let's not forget them. The list goes on and on. And of those recordings, there were 6 Grammy Awards. She has been inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame. She's been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And most recently, she received the highly coveted award, the Gershwin Award. Only 5 other people have received it in the history of the award, and she's the first woman to receive it. She received it in the White House. It was recorded, actually, on television, and it's a piece I really think you should look for. Also, there is a brilliant American Masters sort of biography of Carole King's life. It's an hour long and available on PBS, and it's absolutely extraordinary. You'll hear her do all of her own music in the most extraordinary way, both as a young woman and then as a mature woman. It's an amazing collection of material. The show that you see focuses on Carole King's life from the 1958. She's a young teenage girl, and it goes to 1971 when she performed her Tapestry album at Carnegie Hall. So, I mean, it's a tremendous coming-of-age story. It's a young girl who wrote music for other people, never thinking she would sing, and then, sort of relaunching her career with what would be one of the most memorable albums ever recorded, Tapestry, where she would define an age. All through the 1970s, Tapestry remained on the top list of best-selling albums. It was an extraordinary work, and it's a work that even today people will say, when I'm really feeling depressed, I pull out my Tapestry album and I reconnect with my good friend Carole King, and all is right with the world. So the musical focuses on that very small part of her life. But remember, by 1971, when she created Tapestry, up to that point she had been a songwriter, writing for other groups. But when she wrote Tapestry, she wrote that album for herself. And so she became one of the first great singer-songwriters, and it would really literally redefine the era of popular music. And as you know, in the 70s, we had large numbers of singer-songwriters, et cetera. But Carole King would always remain at the top of the list. But keep in mind, her life would go on. She would have 4 marriages. One marriage ended with an abusive relationship with her husband dying of a drug overdose. Her life has been very tempestuous, had many relationships, has really 2 sets of families. But through it all, she always played her music to her adoring fans and kept a very interesting profile in the world of music. Keep in mind, music is so trendy. Suddenly when Elvis came along, that redefined music. When the Beatles came along, that redefined music, et cetera. But keep in mind, here's Carole King, who moves through all of this period, and she transcends the phases and the trends in music, or is it hard rock, or what is the sound? Her music has remained constant all through these decades. And to many people, she represents the greatest singer-songwriter of the last half of the 20th century. So it's a very interesting life. She's 75 years old. She's still functioning, still turning out brilliant music, still performing to capacity audiences everywhere in the world. There's a side of her that is very private. She lives a large part of her life in Idaho. She has a brilliant autobiography called Natural Woman. I really recommend the autobiography. It's the most simple autobiography that I've read a famous person write. There's no throwing out fancy names. I mean, she does mention spending evenings with John Lennon or Paul McCartney, but it's as though they are just, you know, her musician friends, as of course they are or were. And so the end result is, this is a very simple woman who has this incredible musical gift, not only as a songwriter, but listen carefully to the arrangements, not only the instrumental arrangements, but the vocal arrangements. Keep in mind, in the 60s, when she was coming out with all of these ideas, she's a young girl, she's still a teenager, but also she's sort of redefining popular music. Remember, in the 50s, the music was very sort of bubblegum music, and it was music for teenage kids, and beyond doo-wop, 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 that was about all there was to the substance of a song. And suddenly she's writing songs that are very dimensional, that have meaning, that transcend 50 years. They're as popular today as they were when they were first written. Okay, so let's go to the beginning and see how this whole project evolved. Keep in mind, this is a jukebox musical. And a jukebox musical means that we take a body of music that was written outside of the musical theater, in this case, the body of this incredible artist, Carole King's work, and it's put into the show. But also, they use music from the period, from the 1950s. There was another pair of singer-songwriters that would work in this period. They were lyricist songwriters, and their names were Cynthia Weil and Barry Mann, and they will be subordinate characters in the musical you see. Carole King, in real life, married a young man who would become her major lyricist, and his name was Jerry Goffin. So these two pairs of singer-songwriters would always be in competition all through the 60s, and they would write all of the great songs of the 60s. They were very close friends. They remain very close friends today, but in the process, they were in competition, and so therefore we're having the best of the best music in this show. What happened in the creation of this show, in the case of jukebox musicals, very often the producer plays a very important role in the development of the musical. In this case, the lead producers went to the four artists that I've just talked about, the lyricist songwriters, and said to them, we would like to option your songs to create a musical that would encapsulate the 1960s. And so all four artists agreed, so they made an arrangement to make the rights available for the development of a Broadway musical. Keep in mind, this is producer-oriented. Producers with the idea. In this case, it was the producer who came up with the idea that we will start with the beginning of their careers, late 1958, and move to 1971, when Carole King would write that defining album, Tapestry. So that was decided. The parameters of the musical was decided. But it was meant to be a story about four people. And so as they then had to find a book writer who would take this material and put it all together in the format of dialogue, music, a structural device of telling the story. So the producer then sent out word to several major writers saying, would you do a treatment about this material? And you can come in and meet the four artists and do your pitch about how you would do their lives on the stage. And so one of the people that was considered was Doug McGrath. Now, Doug McGrath is a writer I greatly admire. Many of you may read him. He does feature articles in the New York Times. He writes for Vanity Fair. He writes for The New Republic. He's a very, very interesting writer. And the end result was he also has had a very big career in movies. He did Woody Allen's Bullets Over Broadway and won an Academy Award for his treatment of that story. Just to pause for a moment, what I want you to realize, as in the case with Woody Allen is great at telling jokes and great at setting up incredible situations for movies, but he isn't very strong in developing a structure that will take the story and develop it through the movie. And this is where Doug McGrath came in, and he found a very clear and strong and insightful structure for Bullets Over Broadway to make it the hit that it was, not only as a movie, but also as a musical. Doug McGrath also went on to do many major adaptations. He did an adaptation of Charles Dickens' Nicholas Nickleby, and it was done as a new film, and it was extraordinary and wonderfully received. He took Jane Austen's Emma and redefined it for the film and also directed it. So he's a writer I deeply admire because, number one, he's a brilliant storyteller. And in this case, you had to find someone who could tell this story with great clarity. So when he went for his interview with the four writers, songwriters, he started by saying, well, you know, I see the picture. You're young kids, you're 17 years old, you're starting your career, you want to break down all the old traditions, you're going to create all these new ideas of harmony, a new kind of popular musical sound, you're going to develop new kinds of harmonics for instruments and voices. This is groundbreaking. And you go in and you say, I'm really going to throw out the old and create the new. And so they all sat there with sort of long faces, and Carole King raised her hand and said, well, young man, I do want to tell you, you're absolutely wrong. That isn't what happened at all. We totally admired the past. We all wanted to be Cole Porter. We all wanted to be, you know, Rodgers and Hammerstein. We adored and had memorized all of that popular music of the day, especially the music of the musical theater. And so therefore, no, we were not iconoclasts. We were just learning from the past, and we wanted to take what was happening in musical theater and find a way of making it happen in popular music, so that popular music would have more substance and lyrics, would be more sophisticated musically. So we really did honor the past. So Doug McGrath went out of that meeting saying, well, I certainly lost that job. And lo and behold, the producers called and said, well, they really liked you, and you can come back because you listened very carefully when they told you you were wrong. And so the end result was what Doug McGrath did. He took those four artists that you will see developed as characters in the story. These are real life people. And he heard their histories. And he started with the beginning of their careers, or actually started with their birth, went through how they were raised, what the family background was, what the education was, how they came to music. He covered all the bases. And this is what a good writer does. And it's when you watch the show, you really feel like you know all four of these people. And the reason is Doug McGrath spent the time to really know and understand these people. I want you to be aware of one of the major things that a book writer or a playwright does is, he gets a story. A story means history. So if I were to say to you, tell me your story, you tell me where you were born, where you were educated, who you married, you tell me about your family, you tell me about your life, and you'd bring me up to date. You'd give me your history. If I was writing about you then, I would have to decide how to treat that history. And that's what Doug McGrath did. He listened very carefully to all these stories, and it finally became very clear to him that even though the producers had directed him in the idea of make this a musical about four people, make this about their journey, make this about their incredible friendship that they had, and their competition. They were always in competition with one another. And so knowing all this, as he started to put the material together, it became very clear that the focus was really going to be on Carole King. I mean, the name of all four of those names, the only name that's a universally recognizable name, is Carole King. If you really are a music buff, then you certainly know who these other people are as lyricists or songwriters, but it's the name Carole King that stands out. So he realized that he was going to have to shape the story in a different way. In other words, the first major decision he made was that there was going to be a very clear central protagonist, and the protagonist is that person who carries you through the whole story. So whether it's Hamlet or King Lear or Willy Loman in Death of a Salesman, you've got to have a central character that will lead you through the story. And in this case, it was clearly going to be Carole King. Watch how he develops her. It's very interesting. Let me just go back and tell you this about Carole King. As a young girl, as I told you, I mean, she was so gifted musically. At age 4, she was playing the piano and writing her own music. And so as a her whole childhood was spent at the piano. And by the time she was 16 years old, she was so hungry to write for other artists. She did not want to be a singer. She did not want to be famous. She wanted to be a writer of popular songs. And so at 16, she said to her mother, you know, I have written a song and I want to go into New York and sell it. Now, let me pause for a moment and tell you about the avenues for selling music in New York in this period. There is a very famous building in New York called the Brill, B-R-I-L-L, the Brill Building. And during the period of Tin Pan Alley in the 20s and 30s, it's where all of the writers would go to sell their songs. It's a building that's on Broadway at Times Square. It's at 1619 Broadway. You can go and visit it. It's still a major mecca for music. But starting with Tin Pan Alley and going all the way up to the 1960s, it's where popular music was born. There was also another competing building at 1650 Broadway. And the story that we see all takes place at 1650 Broadway. Again, it's another building dedicated to music. So there's music publishing, there's music recording. Everything happens in this building. But what would happen in these buildings, like at 1650, they really, if we go back to the early 1960s, when Carole King, you know, or in late 1958, when she went into New York to sell her song, they were literally song factories, which meant that there were an enormous number of a warren of rooms, tiny little rooms, and there would be a producer. And the producer would see young people who would bring in their music. He would screen them, hear a song, and say, sorry, we can't use it. Or, yes, I'll buy this song for $25. If I can turn this into a hit, I'll give you a room here. And a room meant that you were given a tiny little cubicle where there was a piano, an ashtray, and you stayed in there. You went in the morning, and you stayed there all day. And the producer would come around and say, the Shirelles need a song. You, and you work on the song. Tomorrow morning you can audition it for me. So literally they would have 24 hours to write a song, come up with an arrangement, convince the Shirelles that they would like the material, and offer it as a popular song. And this is how it worked. Tremendous competition, but this ability to be able to turn out music on demand. I mean, to have a producer come in and say, okay, Aretha Franklin needs a song tomorrow. Come up with something. Base it on the idea of natural woman. And so therefore a brilliant song is created that way by Carole King, incidentally. So anyway, this is the world that the young Carole King is going to. So she says to her mother, I have this song. I'm going to take it to 1650 Broadway and see if I can sell it. And her mother says, where is that? And she says, well, it's at Times Square. And her mother throws her hands up and says, the only thing worse than hell is Times Square. I'm not sending my 16-year-old daughter there. You're forbidden. And of course, she goes anyway, as any good 16-year-old would, and she sells her song. And she finds a space at 1650 Broadway. Now, watch in the show. There's a charming opening scene where you see this sort of an act. And I won't reveal any more of the story for you because it's wonderfully told by Doug McGrath. But there's a scene when she goes to the Brill building. She goes 1650, which still has the Brill sound. And when she gets there, suddenly there's an explosion of music, and you hear all of the popular music that came out of 1650 Broadway. And it brings back so many incredible memories. So whether you were listening to music then or years later going back and listening to it, these were all still enduring songs that you would have heard in the past, and all of them come to you, and you're immediately back in the late 1950s. It's an incredible production number that they create to create the atmosphere of the time and place in these studios. And literally then, for 10 years, Carole King and her husband would work in this highly competitive environment where they would churn out songs on demand. And as we know, artists like to say, I have to be inspired, I have to have the muse tell me what to do. That isn't how it worked there. It was, write the song, we have to have it tomorrow, and that's how it worked. These two couples that you see profiled in the show, they were so competitive with one another. They have remained friends to this very day. And even though the focus of the musical shifted, so it became a musical about Carole King, they all still love and support one another. And I mean, even though there was tremendous competition, there was also tremendous love and respect for one another. So watch that as it plays out in the show. It's wonderfully developed. But what Doug McGrath has really done with the show, watch the development of Carole King. I mean, in real life, she's a 16-year-old girl. She's a kind of paradox. When she burst her way into New York, she was enormously confident. I mean, a 16-year-old girl going into a professional environment saying, I've got a song and I want you to hear it, and it's really good. And then, while she's doing it, she then says, oh, and this is what I do with the arrangement, and this is what I do with the harmonics, and this is what I do with the vocal parts. I mean, her mind was so full of brilliant and innovative and groundbreaking music that it was really dazzling to the producer. So that's who she is on one hand, but on the other hand, she's this very insecure young girl. And she was a child really of the 50s. And remember, young girls at that point were raised to be cute, to find a husband who was going to make a lot of money so they could have a house in the suburbs and raise a family. I mean, that was the mentality of being a young woman in that period. And so on one hand, Carole King had that. And when she did find the young man that she would fall in love with, who would become her partner in music, and ultimately their marriage would, through the 10-year period, ultimately collapse. But in those 10 years, she was married very young, did have children at a very early age. She was still a teenager when she had 2 children. And she would take them into New York, in her arms and play music all day with bassinets in that little room and still playing. I mean, it's an extraordinary development of a career. But what you see, what Doug McGrath has done with this musical that's so clever, and watch how he charts it with her. She was definitely a child of the times, a child of the 1950s. But then, of course, the 60s came along, and everything was radically different. It was the world of hippies, music changed, everything changed, roles changed of what was male and female and what was acceptable and not acceptable. And suddenly, all values changed in this period. And so Carole King would reflect all of that in her music. But watch how it's charted in her life, and watch how clever Doug McGrath is in letting you watch this journey of this young girl really becoming an international superstar along the way, but this young girl becoming a modern woman. And people relate to this very significantly. There are scenes in the show where every woman in the audience applauds because it's sort of a redefining of who a woman is and what a woman's potential is in the world. And he uses Carole King as a wonderful example of that as we move through the story. So the story becomes very universal, and we relate to it very significantly. Also, she's in many ways abused by a husband who is indifferent to the marriage and indifferent to the marriage vows, and we side very strongly with her as she moves her way through. So interesting. We then understand, she writes this groundbreaking album called Tapestry, and she finally says, I'm not writing it for someone else, I'm writing it for myself. I'm going to sing this album myself. And again, she would help to invent, in the early 1970s, the singer-songwriter. And so, you know, she would be the first and one of the best in the world to do this. But it's about this girl becoming a woman and this girl finding her sense of self. And we so cheer this as we watch the progression of the musical. It's wonderfully developed. Also watch what Doug McGrath does. He embeds the music into the storyline. It is never incidental that a song is placed in a particular segment of the story. He was sort of bound by the idea of chronology. I mean, she wrote the music in a chronological way, and he really had to use it in that way. But what makes it so brilliant is he finds a way of placing it in the story so it's so perfect for the situation. And what you start seeing is that so much of her music really did come out of her life. And when you listen to Tapestry, you know, in the 1970s, for that whole decade, I mean, it was everyone's favorite album. And if something depressing happened or you had a bad day at the office, you'd go home and lock the door and play Tapestry because you were with your best friend, Carole King, and you were also then hearing music that really connected to you. It was so deeply personal. But it was deeply personal to her when she wrote it. The autobiography is very revealing in that regard, that her music so strongly really reflected her life. And you know, the reason that we so connect to that music is because there's so much truth in the music. Okay, so we have this show then that's perfectly structured. It focuses on a hero that we love to cheer for. It's someone who comes to a real sense of enlightenment about herself personally and about the quality of her music. She would shape all of music with that Tapestry album. And then what you're seeing then is a show that's wonderfully directed, that's wonderfully illustrated in that the sets are spectacular. I mean, you watch all those scenes when the Shirelles come out or the boy singers come out, and all those memories that we have and all those moves that they do, we recognize all of them. And we can almost do them in our seats. I mean, watch the audience as they're watching the show. Everybody's bouncing around. And whether you have gray hair or not, everybody's bouncing around. I have to tell you, when I was working on this, I was playing the album a great deal, and finally one day, I blush to tell you this story, but the Locomotion came on, and I found myself standing in the middle of the room doing the Locomotion. Now, this is not a pretty sight for an old guy to be doing this, but I want to just tell you a wonderful story about that song, and again, this is also Carole King. She had these two babies, and you know, she was going into the city having to write every day, so she found this young girl who had a great voice, and she said, you know, I promise you I'll use you on some of my demo records. What they used to do when they were trying to get Aretha Franklin to like a song, they would do a demo of it so she could hear all the backups and what the musicality would be of it. And so they used backup singers, as they were called. So she said, this girl, I'll use you as a backup singer, I'll use you on the demos, but will you be my babysitter? And she said, absolutely. So lo and behold, what they did was they wrote a song for their babysitter called Locomotion. Their babysitter was called Little Eva, and so she would become a star overnight. I always wondered with that name, Little Eva, didn't anyone read Uncle Tom's Cabin in the 60s? I don't know. But anyway, Little Eva became the hit. And Carole King tells a personal story in her autobiography that's delightful, saying, you know, suddenly we had a hit song about a dance called The Locomotion, but there really was no dance called The Locomotion. So poor Little Eva, the first time she was on television, you know, they said, okay, do the dance. And so, you know, her eyes got very big, and she invented the locomotion, and everybody then followed that for years. I mean, it was a great rage. So you'll be doing the Locomotion by the time you leave the show tonight, I promise. So you've got a beautifully mounted show, a wonderfully told story with spectacular music. It is truly what the best of this kind of biographical musical theater can be. It's wonderfully told, and it gives you a tremendous evening. So I do think you will feel the earth move under your feet tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.